regulators need to become technologically skilled. And I don't mean you need to code. I don't mean that regulators need to actually build these systems. But you've got to understand, if you want to really take charge, you have to roll up your sleeves and get in there with the techies who are building the protocols to ensure that the protocols they build are actually reflecting the legislative policy principles that you have. That thinking needs to now permeate through Brussels.
Hello, this is Chloe Tevan, and this is Europolis, the Global Europe podcast. So, Gautam, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
You recently interviewed Rahul Matthan, who is one of India's leading technology lawyers, and really one of the minds behind India's approach to data protection within its digital public infrastructure in particular, which is the famous India stack. Maybe to start with, why is it important that we're talking about India's approach to technology and to regulating technology?
Well, it's simply because of India's phenomenal experience in the last decade of sort of rolling out and digitalizing their economy. This really has a huge consequence for Europe as well, because India is now probably the third largest or number 3 in terms of digitalization of their economy. And there's a lot of lessons that we can all learn.
But maybe we should go into a little bit more what is digital public infrastructure for those who don't know. India Stack really is the key
benchmark, if you will.
The benchmark when it comes to this question. But there are more and more countries around the world now, including ultimately the European Union member states, that are now basically developing.
I mean, it's true that the Indians have gotten a lot of credit for popularizing DPI as an idea. You have digital public infrastructure now being referred to in the UN, for example, and many countries are sort of looking at Indian leadership. The question is how different is having digital public infrastructure compared to just having digital infrastructure? And the key question there is the word public. The key difference there, I think, is in the way, in the sort of control question of the different layers. So by building, for example, the bank-to-bank financial rails, the Indian government retains control over what kind of fees are charged, for example, for each transaction, or which kind of players can build on top of that infrastructure. And these are all sort of questions on sort of both corporate power and also sort of competitiveness to some extent. Because if you are talking about sovereignty and you're talking about reliance on sort of big tech platforms or platforms that are not local or from third countries, I think the approach that the Indians have used can be a good sort of template to try to see where in our technology stack do we have concerns about sovereignty, but also concerns about that are similar to the Indian objectives.
Well, I think maybe within the current context in Europe, we're talking a lot about these questions of competitiveness, but also about this question of one of the elements, not the only one, but one of the elements in terms of, say, the dominance of cloud services by the 3 big American hyperscalers. One of the questions that often comes up is this question of interoperability. Yeah. If there was to be a kind of interoperable protocol, that it might actually enable these smaller European players to actually work together and to build a competitive offering.
And I think architecturally it's possible to enable this. The Commission can come in and write a protocol that enables cloud switching. Same concept can be...
Because just to be clear, this is already contained in the regulation.
Indeed.
Both the Data Act and
it's even in
GDPR.
I mean, we have a right to data portability. This has been the case for many years. The question then is, how are we able to, in the real world, benefit from this right? How are we going to effectively implement it?
So there are clearly some differences in terms of the approach adopted, in terms of the objectives between India and Europe. We're not saying for a moment that India is the perfect model for Europe to follow, but rather that there are interesting things to be learned from the Indian experience. And I think that was why you wanted to interview Rahul Matthan, right?
Yeah, so Rahul is one of the leading technology lawyers in India. He works as a managing partner at the largest law firm in India, but he was trilegal. But he was also very, very close to Justice Sri Krishna when the first Indian data protection bill was being discussed, and he's been involved in that process deeply. And I think better than most, he understands both the legal concerns and the sort of policy imperatives, but also what is possible with technology. And I think when I asked him, I think one thing that really stood out in our interview was when I asked him what's the one piece of advice you would give the European Commission and the European institutions, he said it's very important to have a sort of technology lens when you're trying to draft and implement policies. And he suggested having a sort of close cooperation with a set of technologists that are advocating for the public interest, but also understand the technology and the stack infrastructure in a way that it's more sort of easier to implement public interest in the digital economy. And I think that takeaway is something that we should also reflect.
Let's dive into the interview.
Sounds good. So I'm really pleased that we have Rahul joining us. Thank you, Rahul, for your time.
My pleasure.
Let's dive right into it. The reason why we're sort of discussing today is I'm sure you've heard Europe is sort of getting inspired by the Indian way of data governance and thinking about how to shape technology policy moving forward. I guess my first question to you is could you explain a little bit more how what is the third way in your opinion? How is this different from the American and the European way as you describe in your book? And what are some of the key features that are transferable, if you will, from India to Europe?
So to answer your question, I think specifically what the third way is about is, when I say it's the third way, obviously there's a first and a second way. And the first way that I articulate in the book, and that's just a way of thinking. This is not a clear, defined, sort of segregated definition. But the first way is how the internet evolved and how just this whole digital space evolved, which is if you go back to the US and you go back to the Communications Decency Act and Section 230, essentially the regulators in the US said this is a very promising new technology and we should stay away from regulating it. We should allow this space to develop, because if we stifle it with regulation, we are sort of going to kill something which is very promising. And so they did that, and continue to do that. And so the first way is really no regulation. There are rules of the road, as it were, because the companies that are rolling out these technologies still have to abide by the rules of the road. But within the digital space, regulation takes place by the private sector, because there are terms and conditions that the private sector set out, and you have to abide by them if you are operating on the infrastructure that the private sector builds. Now, obviously, the problem with that is that the private sector is very much driven by shareholder incentives and other considerations. A lot of them are good, but a lot of them sometimes are not perfectly aligned with the way in which the rest of society has to work. And we've all seen the harmful outcomes of these in all the big private infrastructure that has been built. Social media, communications. We've seen all the downsides of that. And so Europe comes up with a different approach, which is a very strong regulatory approach. And Europe, in a sense, leads the world in articulating the regulations for the digital space that companies that operate in the digital space have to adhere to. So this is a shift from the complete laissez-faire, hands-off approach that the internet started with, to a more prescriptive approach where we're saying exactly what you can and cannot do. And even if you put terms and conditions, those terms and conditions have to now adhere to this new reality. And as you said, we found through the Draghi report, through all the conversations that have been happening over the course of this year, that there is also there's also a way to do too much regulation. And if you do too much regulation, obviously, the consequence, as you said, was less innovation. And so I started thinking about whether the approach could be, in a sense, a mixture of the two. Could we, in some ways, embed the regulations that Europe so wants into the infrastructure that we so need. And so could we articulate a framework in which we have what I call techno-legal regulation, where the technology architecture, the technology infrastructure itself has within it the regulatory principles that we all know and think is important. And so India Stack, in quite a remarkable way, is a manifestation of that. And I say remarkable because many of the elements of India Stack, our identity system, our payment system, etc., are truly remarkable population scale innovation. So through India Stack, we are able to see that this idea of techno-legal regulation can be applied at population scale to implement some of these principles directly into the infrastructure. And so because it's implemented in the infrastructure, we now have a really effective way of enforcing some of the principles that I think Europe wants to implement. So, I mean, I think we're not that far apart. I don't think we could have built the techno-legal regulation without the idea of what the regulatory principles should be. And that's very much what Europe has done. And I think what Europe has failed to do, and that's just the last leg of this, has failed to actually find an effective way to embed these regulations into the infrastructure. Because if you don't do that, what happens is that you have the regulations, but you can only enforce the regulation when harm has happened. And then you go back and say, look, you violated the regulation, and so I'm going to punish you or whatever. And that's really... I'm not a huge fan of ex-ante regulation, but I think that if we can more clearly define the rules of the road so that when you, and this is the other element of this stack approach, is that all the participants on the infrastructure, by virtue of participating, are complying with the regulations. Because if you agree to give up your private infrastructure and use these public rails that have now been built to adhere to the policy requirements, then just by virtue of participating on these public rails, you will be compliant. And I think that's really the next step that I think Europe should now be thinking of undertaking.
This is a really helpful way to frame this, because I often hear that there are differences in the way the third way is being positioned, and the European sort of approach has a more, let's say, they index more around privacy, around fundamental rights, and it's possible that such a stack approach would increase opportunities for both privacy leakages and for surveillance, etc. And I think framing it in this way is actually helpful, because it is true that the Indian government and the European side have similar concerns, and they're wrestling with, I guess, fundamentally what is a sort of balance of power, or a sort of renegotiation of the power dynamic that come with large digital companies that are often from outside, that are coming in and have an impact on your societies and your citizens. And so I guess fundamentally there's both a sovereignty angle here, but also a power angle. And so philosophically, I think Europe and India are aligned in this way. And the third way is essentially a more effective techno-legal approach to echo Lawrence Lessig's famous theory, I think the India stack can be best described as the only manifestation of Lessig's theories in the policy world, probably. But just to explain this to the legal nerds
No, I mean,
who
look,
follow this. But
Lessig was a huge inspiration to me. When he wrote Code and the Other Laws of Cyberspace was 25 years ago, 25 years ago, and he wrote that at a time when really the internet was a niche thing. There was few people who were operating on the internet. But India and the India stack has actually shown. I mean, just the statistics are quite staggering. It's worth mentioning: 1.4 billion people have got a digital identity today. Our payment system does 18 billion transactions a month, which means by the end of today, 600 million payment transactions would have been completed, which is pretty staggering. We're on track for a billion a day. And there are a number of other systems that are incredibly powerful, but also have keep in mind the considerations of privacy, of autonomy over personal data, and things like that. And at the same time, I think provide effective tools to balance things like competition, to level the playing field, these sorts of other features. So, I mean, I think it's. I'm glad you brought up Lessig, because really, I feel that his idea was ahead of its time, and I'm glad that we can actually show it can be implemented.
So I just wanted to move now to this idea of what do we do in the future, given this sort of expansion of the technology stack that's important for sovereignty reasons. To summarize it very bluntly, how should countries like India, like countries in the EU, react to this power imbalance between, say, the big tech companies coming from both the US and from China, on the platform side, primarily from the US, also cloud, but on the infrastructure side from China? I recently read, for example, that the Indian government is worried about CCTV cameras. And so IoT devices are super sensitive, and that's again driven by this idea that data can be sent to different places in a very insecure way. And so, coming to this issue of this concern of sovereignty, what should countries like India, like countries in the EU, what should they really, how should they implement such a techno-legal framework? Like, what are the core sort of enabling factors that need to be in place, and how could they, for example, collaborate or create economies of scale? And of course, now we're moving from the India stack part to the more sort of generic concerns, which also include, for example, having the right amount of data centers, having access to critical raw materials, making sure that platforms are fair, and there's competition concerns taken care of, and so on.
Yeah, no. So very important question, and needs two separate sorts of answers. So let me just tackle the hard infrastructure first, right? So I think if you're worried about hard infrastructure, and you mentioned CCTV cameras, I think everyone should be worried about it, because I think some ridiculous number, 60-70% of all webcams that are now used pretty much everywhere are made out of China. And even if it appears like they're made in Europe, it would perhaps be just white labeled, but actually made out of China. And there are many other similar concerns. I think the whole 5G stack, the IP in the 5G stack is just none of that IP exists in the Western world, and so there's some serious concerns with the hard infrastructure. And the only way to mitigate that concern is really to bring some of that manufacturing in to places where perhaps you at least provide some sort of a alternative to the current single source of this equipment. That's not an easy problem. That's an expensive problem, but if it is something that is of concern. There is no option but to do that investment and diversify the manufacture of some of these things, because it is hard infrastructure and it has to be physically manufactured somewhere. As far as the soft infrastructure is concerned, which is now right at the other end of the spectrum, that sort of three-layered cake that you described, the hard infrastructure is at the bottom. That's the wires, the routers, all of those sorts of things. And the soft infrastructure is the platforms. And here I think we have a lot more of an option. And that is really where the third way comes in, because the problem that you have is that the soft infrastructure is now entirely end-to-end provisioned by the private sector. And all we need to do is change that slightly. I'm for one, absolutely not advocating for making this entirely government run. I think that would be a very bad idea, because governments are great for all sorts of things. The one thing they're really not good for is innovation. They have no incentive to innovate. They have just no muscles to innovate. So we really don't want to give government the responsibility of actually doing something innovative. What we do want, though, is we want the government to exercise an appropriate amount of control over the soft infrastructure. And I argue that the way in which we can do that is to wrest away from the private sector the core protocols on which that infrastructure has to perform. So you say that, if you're building a payment system, I don't want bank A and bank B to agree, or 5, 10 banks in Europe to agree that this is the protocol they will use, but I will tell you the protocol. That protocol will be prescribed by me, and it's a very basic thing. It's just a bunch of connectors which say that, look, this is what the debit side of the balance sheet needs to look like. This is what an API call would be if you're transferring money using your RTGS system, whatever it is. I mean, they're just a very, very simple, neutral. It has to be technology neutral. Is set of hooks that say this is the way in which system A can integrate with system B, and then leave it to the private sector to do all the innovation around that. We have to let the private sector come up with new innovative ways in which to connect these things, because that's what their incentive is. And so I think with that slight modification, we can get much more control over the soft infrastructure. How we do it in each sector is something that we're going to have to develop. I think in most countries, the financial sector is the most advanced from a digital perspective. In many countries, the health sector is also very advanced, but there are many other sectors that are not so advanced. But if you look at it in every single sector, just take mobility. Right now, Uber and various other companies are actually providing mobility solutions in countries, but they're providing it end to end. And it's actually very simple to just provide a protocol that will ensure that, say, one ride-sharing company can interact with perhaps public transport or something like that. That would be a real innovation that would, quite frankly, help the public sector. And also, the private sector would love to provide this value-added service. I'm making things up as we go along, but then you leave it to the private sector. You just build these enabling protocols, and I think you'll find even more innovation than what you could do. So I think there's less hope in the hard infrastructure because it's a long-term solve. But in the soft infrastructure, there is a lot that we can do even now to sort of add this very thin layer of techno-legal governance and not regulation more as much as actual governance.
This what you're describing also has another effect, which is it sort of unlocks a lot of the market power that exists with these different platforms, right? And this has obviously been a core concern of the European Commission and all of the European policymakers. And I think as they reflect now on how the DMA is doing, for example, or how the AI Act will be implemented, it's looking kind of like a losing battle to some extent, because a lot of these companies haven't really changed their business models significantly. Neither have they, very willingly sort of made massive changes to to allow others to get more access to some of this power. So the question, I guess, is this could be another approach to sort of implement some of the objectives of the DMA. I'm just wondering now that, given that India is doing it the other way, where they have sort of created some of these, you have the ONDC, for example, for e-commerce, the beckon protocol. What is the Indian experience like? Is it necessary for the Indians to also have something like the DMA to complement the existing opening up, or is it creating enough competition? Are these large platforms playing on these protocols and so on? Just to get a sense.
Well, so once again, it's early days, and the immediate glib answer is yes, people are playing on them, but they're not playing on them at the scale that you've seen in the payment system, and so you're not seeing sort of that level of numbers. But certainly, yes, we have ONDC, which is an open network for digital commerce. The beckon protocol is just a protocol for open transactions, so it's an open transaction network. Currently, we're thinking of applications as wide-ranging as commerce, as you just mentioned, but also in relation to the energy transition. I think the big challenge that we have right now is we've got centralized power generation distribution, and we have to move to a world with decentralized and intermittent power, which is a non-trivial challenge. But you can do it if you can build open transaction networks to allow all of these things on a peer-to-peer basis to share with each other. Once again, very much a protocol play, and we're actually working on stuff like that. But just to get back to the broader point of competition, DMA, DSA, stuff like that. First, I think none of this works without the bedrock of the law. So India needs to have these regulations. We're currently thinking of a Digital Competition Act, which is very much along the lines of what Europe has done. But I think as you're noticing, it's not enough just to have the law. You've got to have some mechanism by which the ideas in the law can actually be implemented at the speed of the internet. And laws tend to work at the speed of offline transactions, but the internet doesn't wait for those sorts of things to happen. So we've got to change the way in which we do it. And so I think the use of this sort of thinking is going to be very useful in the hands of a regulator, and Europe must certainly consider this. So one of the ways in which we think about this is that we are unlocking abundance. We believe that we have an abundant store of the information that we need, and information is just this remarkably powerful resource. But that abundant store is currently locked up in many different silos that are really inaccessible. And even for the private sector company that is in charge of a particular silo, right now you'll find that the companies are not changing their ways because they think that, look, this is my silo that I've built up over years. I spent a lot of money and now I've got it, and it's my absolutely valuable resource. But if you can show them that there is another company that has built another resource, which may not be exactly your resource, but is in many ways complementary, they will find that there is a lot of additional revenue that they can get by somehow innovating with that other silo. And so rather than tell them, you should not and you should open up, you should just say, look, pay to play. You open up yours, you get access to that silo. The two silos together actually allow you to offer fabulous new innovative products to your customers who will like you all the more, and sort of talk like that. But the center of all of this has got to be, you can't just plug one data silo into the other without the consent, without the control of the user to whom it depends. And if you want to do that, you've got to build a really effective set of pipes with very, very efficient consent mechanisms or alternative mechanisms that would ensure that the user that is benefiting from this is actually completely in control of what is happening. So I think the idea, and I'm sure this resonates with Europe and the European Commission, is there is a lot of abundance, and we're just going to unlock the abundance. And we're not really, the idea is not to cut you down. It's just to allow you to do more, but do more in an ethical and people-centric way.
No, absolutely. And I think, I mean, if you read the EU data strategy, if you read the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, the primary concern in Brussels had been that we have all of this industrial data, for example. Lots of IoT devices, lots of industrial machines, how do they communicate with each other? How do these companies share data with each other so that value is unlocked in the process? And I think this is exciting because it actually provides an answer to some of these big questions that have been hanging up and quite unsuccessfully. But this has been fascinating. I think if just to sort of end this podcast, if you have any advice for European policymakers in terms of, I know you're very erudite in terms of what the EU is thinking about and what their laws are and how to comply with them, but how should Europe? What are the 2 or 3 things that we should do? Potentially, get closer to India, have more of these track 1.5 exchanges, open the markets so that companies can interact much more and potentially build these solutions that you spoke of. But so, in your mind, as a sort of parting piece of advice, what would you like to say to Europe and European policymakers and potentially also the Indian side and see how we can sort of collaborate with one another moving forward?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we obviously should collaborate. The first time I actually took these ideas to Europe was in the height of COVID, and it was remarkable how resonant it was. When I was speaking to regulators at the CNIL, they were quite impressed by how it ticked all the GDPR boxes in a sense, and so the data regulator, obviously they aren't going to give me a certificate, but they're saying yes, this does, if this does work as it's advertised, it does tick all of the boxes. But I think the sort of the important thing, the in a sense the heavy lift, which is perhaps not something that Europe is currently used to, is that your regulators need to become technologically skilled. And I don't mean you need to code. I don't mean that regulators need to actually build these systems. But you've got to understand the way that this sort of a techno-legal implementation of your principles work. And it's not a skill that Europe doesn't have, because the EIDAS wallet is very much a manifestation of a techno-legal infrastructure by which European identities can be acceptable across the world. Now, you couldn't build that. It was very much a techno-legal implementation, if I can say that that is what it was. And that thinking needs to now permeate through Brussels. You must continue to write the laws, you must continue to write the regulations and provide the guidance and all of those things. But if you want to really take charge of the digital space in the way that a stack will allow you to, you have to roll up your sleeves and get in there with the techies who are building the protocols to ensure that the protocols they build are actually reflecting the legislative policy principles that you have. I am not a techie. I don't understand code, but I understand enough to actually be able to say that, look, we've really got to build it in this way and not in that way. And I've had a wonderful experience over 15 years actually working with a lot of the people that build India Stack to shape some of the direction in which this is going. I'm not saying that I've influenced a lot, but just having an understanding of the capacity of technology allows regulators much more leeway in their policy objectives. And similarly, to have a set of technologists who work with regulators to understand what the policy objective is going to make them much better at sort of building out these systems for the common good. This is a bit of a lift. When I've spoken to a lot of people, I think this really is the one thing that I think also perhaps there's a mental block. I think regulators feel that, or policymakers feel that this is something they can't understand. They've studied all their lives with the code, but with the code of law, not the code of code. But I think this is certainly something that we should really work to build within Brussels and within all of the various countries in the EU, because I think this is the future.
That's absolutely sage advice. I couldn't have put it better. There's an issue in Europe on the whole. There's a need for some 20 million ICT professionals by 2030, and we are in the better part of 2025 now, and we have less than 10 million. At the moment. So it is not that the Europeans are swimming in abundance in terms of tech tech and policy skills.
We have a lot in India. We can loan you some. Remember, we're always there.
So it's been fascinating. Thank you so much, Rahul, for your time. This has been phenomenal, and we'll keep you posted in terms of how ECDPM is engaging with the EU and the India sides, and we hope that we can sort of come to this techno-legal approach, this third way together at some point. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
So I really liked Rahul's point about unlocking the abundance. And again, India and Europe may approach this slightly differently, might have different policy objectives, but ultimately what he discusses is really putting in place a framework in order to help make this happen, I guess. And at the moment, the EU and India are planning the third Trade and Technology Council, following quite quickly on the second TTC, which took place in February. And I guess, as we look towards the next TTC, what do you think are some of the potential areas for the EU and India to work more closely together around this idea of unlocking the abundance?
I think, so that's a great phrase that he used. And if you read the data strategy that Thierry Breton had spearheaded, it's almost exactly using these terms. It's talking about unlocking the potential of the data that is not being used at the moment. There's a sense that we have a lot of data being generated, especially in Europe, on industry, industrial data, IoT data, these kinds of things where people aren't even involved, just machines generating data. And one of the core questions when the data strategy was being discussed was, how do you unlock this hidden data, if you will? And now we have not just the Data Act, but we also have the Data Governance Act. And I think a lot of the act is focused on ensuring that citizens can use this hidden treasure trove of data, if you will. I think in terms of what the EU and India should focus on next, I think it's exactly finding a way to have frameworks that are not just interoperable or creating interoperability within their own regions, but also having frameworks that join up the two regions. In terms of having similar protocols, in terms of having alignment on the objectives. Because at the end of the day, I don't see that much of a difference between what Rahul was saying and what Thierry Breton's concerns were in the last commission, right? It's very much coming from this position of two sort of middle to great powers feeling like they've sort of losing sovereignty and losing control over their digital ecosystems. So given that that's the place they're coming from, the only sort of difference I would say would be in terms of what are the immediate objectives or what are the immediate policy focus areas for each of the governments. So the Indians, for example, want to focus on innovation and unlocking AI, using the data of Indians to ensure that the AI revolution is representative of Indian languages and so on and so forth. These are the same concerns that Europe has, for
Yeah,
example.
absolutely. I think that goes beyond the EU and India, and this is what we will be looking into in the next few podcasts, is this question of, whether we use the terminology of sovereignty or not, whether or competitiveness, as it may be in the European case. I think these questions around how do you build an indigenous digital sector, how do you make sure that the AI that will power future growth and future productivity is actually and that will ultimately lead to sustainable development and better outcomes for humans is ultimately what we hope for. No matter what the geographic context, I think there are these questions around how do we do that. And so I think this question around DPI is part of a wider global discussion that we will be having in the months and years to come with Brazil, with South Africa, the African Union, partners all over the world. So I think watch out for future podcasts. Thank you for joining. This was Europolis, and I'm Chloe Teven.
And I'm Gautam Kamath. We'll see you later.